In this video, I'll show you how to use MIDI GOBLIN to save and load patches for synthesizers that have MIDI in and output connections. Now, if you know your synthesizer like the back of your hand and you've already got a good grasp of MIDI, you probably don't need to watch this whole video. Here's the too long didn't read version of it. Patch saving works for CC and NRPN parameters, no sysx at this point. Add your synth to the MIDI GOBLIN using the MIDI GOBLIN wizard if it's not already pre-installed. Plug your synth's output into the MIDI GOBLIN's input and the MIDI GOBLIN's output into your synth's input. Turn on MIDI GOBLIN, select your synth, go to settings, set the patches app to your synth's receive channel, then press the back button and save your settings. Send MIDI GOBLIN all of your synth's parameter values, go to the patches app, and you can save and load patches there. It's pretty simple. I've also got a Patreon now. Well, that's it for this video. I've made a few videos in the past covering patch saving for various synthesizers, but this is going to be a generalized tutorial meant to cover patch saving for all synths that have MIDI in and out connections. Before we get started, if you missed out on the MIDI GOBLIN Kickstarter, you can actually pre-order one right now through BackerKit. MIDI GOBLIN isn't just a device for saving and loading patches though, it's also an arpeggiator, MIDI monitor, MIDI CC LFO, chord and scale generator, patch morpher, remapper, 32-step sequencer, MIDI controller, and I'm working on adding more things in the future. On that note, I now have a Patreon as well. I'll still be making these tutorial videos for free, of course, for everybody. But you can subscribe to the Patreon to just help fund the production of these videos, as well as give me some encouragement to continue making new features for MIDI GOBLIN down the road, and maybe some programming tutorials as well in the future. It's completely optional, but if you want to show your support, check out the Patreon. Now you might be asking yourself, what the heck's a patch? Well, it's basically just a snapshot of your synthesizer's current settings. The reason we call it a patch has to do with the history of synthesis. Back in the day, you had to physically patch modules together to get certain sounds out of big old synthesizers. People still like to do this with Eurorack, but that's not really my thing. Thankfully, MIDI was invented in the 80s, and one of its primary uses is to control and save the parameter values of your synthesizer using little messages that contain information. MIDI messages. Now, despite having the ability to transmit and receive MIDI control change messages for parameter values, a lot of synthesizers on the market nowadays still don't have the ability to save patches locally, and some of them have limited patch storing capacity as well. Now, some synthesizers have patch library and software available on computers, but consider this. Video games, Reddit, Amazon, Netflix, and infinite. Your synthesizer is competing against all of these things. Thankfully, MIDI GOBLIN can save and load patches, and it's tiny, and it looks cool. The setup process is a little bit annoying, but it's pretty easy, and thankfully you only have to do it once, so let's get busy. First, check your manual to make sure your synth can accept control change or NRPN messages to control its parameters. For this Yamaha CS, you can see it has a nice list of them. Here they are laid out over top of the control parameters. Also, some synthesizers have special settings for MIDI control change messages, so make sure your synth sends messages when parameter values are changed, and that it can also receive incoming messages to control parameter values. In the case of the CS, all you have to do is turn on MIDI control by holding down E2 and powering on the synthesizer. These two lights will go solid to indicate that MIDI control is enabled. Next up, just check and see what channel your synth sends and receives MIDI messages on. Some synths can send and receive on different channels, whereas others just send and receive on one channel. This is fine, but just a heads up, make sure you know what channel your synth is receiving MIDI messages on. Next up, you need to add your synth to the MIDI GOBLIN. It's a pretty easy process. You just have to take the micro SD card out of the MIDI GOBLIN itself, then plug it into your computer. Then use the MIDI GOBLIN wizard to add your synth to the micro SD card. Just list your synth's parameter names and numbers, or NRPN numbers. Press the create button and it'll generate a folder, and then just drag that folder onto the micro SD card. And don't forget to put the micro SD card back in the MIDI GOBLIN, or none of that will work. MIDI GOBLIN comes with a few synths pre-installed, the Yamaha CS being one of them, so if you have a Yamaha CS as well, just skip all of that, it's already installed. Now we're ready to connect the synthesizer to the MIDI GOBLIN. Using two 5-pin MIDI cables, connect the synthesizer's output to the MIDI GOBLIN's input, and then the MIDI GOBLIN's output to your synthesizer's input. Power on your MIDI Goblin, select your synthesizer, go to Settings, and then go to MIDI Channels, and set the channel for patches to your synthesizer's receive channel. Then press the back button and save your settings. When we send a patch file from the MIDI Goblin, it's going to transmit over that channel into your synth. And now we're ready to save some patches. When you change your synthesizer's parameters by sliding sliders or twisting knobs, your synth will automatically transmit MIDI messages to the MIDI Goblin. You can view this in real time using MIDI Goblin's Monitor app. The Monitor app displays a list of all your synth's parameters, as well as their CC numbers and values, as well as the channel that the message was received on. The Monitor also has a bonus feature. It can display received note message values. If I move this attack slider up and down, you can see the value change on the MIDI Goblin. And a little dot's going to pop up next to it. Now this little dot's important because it indicates that the parameter value has been received and that that parameter value will be saved into the patch files. So if I save this patch right now, only the attack value would be saved. The reason it works like this is because MIDI Goblin can only save values it's received. This prevents saving patches with values that are 0, and also allows you to save partial patches as well if you really want to do that for some reason. Partial patches are only partially useful though, so just fiddle around with all your knobs and sliders and switches and get a reading on everything. The Yamaha CS has a really neat feature where if you just turn it off and then turn it back on, it dumps all of its parameter values automatically. Other synths have dump commands as well, but not all of them do. Fiddling with all your knobs and sliders is kind of annoying to do every time you start things up, but there's a workaround for this and I'll get back to it in a second. Anyways, now that everything's synced up, go to the Patches menu and press Save New. Use the left and right button to move the cursor and use the encoder to change the letter. Press the Yes button when you're done to save. Save some patches, load some patches, you're in business. Now if your synth doesn't dump all of its parameter values on startup or doesn't have a dump command, it'd be pretty annoying to have to fiddle with all the parameters every time you start things up. But thankfully there's a workaround for that. You just have to do it once. Go through the process of fiddling with all the sliders and knobs and switches one time, and then save that patch. The next time you start up MIDI Goblin, just load that patch. Since the MIDI Goblin has transmitted all those values back to your synthesizer, it'll also know exactly what all your current parameter values are. If you go back to the MIDI monitor, you'll notice that there's dots next to all of the parameter names. Any changes you make from there will be reflected in the monitor, and any patches you save after that will be up to date and accurate. And that's it for this video. I'm going to have some more patch related videos coming in the near future. They'll cover saving patches for synths with no MIDI output using external MIDI controllers, as well as MIDI Goblin's new built-in MIDI controller app. Don't forget to press the subscribe button or like button if you like this video. Patreon's available as well, although you will still get the same content. It's a nice way to support the channel. And if you want to pre-order a MIDI Goblin, the wait time is expected to be a couple months before you'll receive them. I'm currently working through the Kickstarter back orders right now, but it can be pre-ordered through backerkit.com. There's a link in the description and on MIDIGoblin.com as well.